For the first time in roughly 100 years, something very unusual is happening in the United States. More Americans are choosing to live abroad than to move in. Curious. I'm not talking about tourists, students on a semester off, or retirees escaping winter for a few months. I'm talking about families moving their children into foreign school systems, mid-career professionals relocating their work lives, entrepreneurs setting up companies overseas, and parents making a long-term bet on a different country. Thoughtful. If you look back to the Great Depression, it's hard to find a modern moment that looks exactly like this. Yet right now, if you track foreign residency permits, second passport applications, and international university enrollments, they all seem to be telling a similar story. Many Americans are quietly packing up and starting fresh somewhere else. In official talking points, lower immigration into the U.S. and higher deportation numbers are often presented as policy wins. But if you look beyond that surface narrative, you see another trend. A growing number of citizens are not being pushed out by force. They're choosing to step away. And when people from one of the wealthiest and most influential countries in the world begin to feel that their future might be safer, more stable, or simply less stressful somewhere else, that raises a bigger question. Is this mostly about politics? Is it economic stress? Or are we seeing an early sign of a deeper change in how Americans view their own country and their own opportunities? Some commentators have started calling this the Donald Dash. The label isn't what matters. The underlying reasons do. I'm Artur, and today we're going to unpack what's actually going on beneath the headlines. We'll set aside the outrage cycles and focus on the measurable demographic changes that suggest something historically important may be taking shape. This isn't about a handful of viral social media posts from people working on laptops by the beach. It's about data, real choices families are making, and the long-term effects when workers, parents, and business builders decide their prospects might be stronger elsewhere. We'll look at three things: the numbers, the patterns in who is leaving and why, and what this could mean for the U.S. in the coming decades, especially at a time when leaders say they're concerned about birth rates, economic growth, and long-term stability. If Americans are moving abroad in unusually high numbers, that's not just a lifestyle fad. It's a signal. And signals like this usually have causes. Quick note before we continue. Nothing in this video is financial, legal, tax, or immigration advice. It's for educational purposes only. Always do your own research and consult qualified professionals before making big decisions about money or relocation. One of the first objections you hear when this topic comes up is, where's the proof? And that's a reasonable question. The U.S. government does not maintain a comprehensive system that tracks every citizen who leaves and settles elsewhere. Much of that infrastructure was phased out years ago. So there's no single official dashboard blinking red. In situations like this, you look at indirect evidence. And right now, a lot of those indicators seem to be pointing in the same direction. Since the pandemic, multiple countries have reported sharp increases in the number of residence permits granted to U.S. citizens. Portugal is a prominent example. In just a few years, its American population has grown by roughly 5 times. That's not just a small bump. That's a major shift. Ireland and Germany have also seen record inflows of U.S. nationals. Applications from Americans for British and Irish citizenship have reached all-time highs. Even the number of people going through the complex process of giving up U.S. citizenship, a process that requires forms, fees, and careful planning, spiked around the 2024 transition back to Donald Trump's presidency and, according to reports, has stayed elevated. These aren't all measuring the same thing. Some track residency, some track citizenship, some track renunciation. They're coming from different governments, yet they all broadly point in one direction. More Americans are formalizing ties elsewhere. Education offers another lens. More than 100,000 U.S. students are now enrolled at universities abroad, which is a record. Meanwhile, enrollment of foreign students in American universities, historically a key channel for attracting new talent, has dipped from earlier peaks in some recent years. That matters because international education often leads to long-term settlement. Students do internships, get job offers, build families. So, when more Americans are going out for degrees and relatively fewer foreign students are coming in. That's a sign of changing talent flows. Add in surging passport applications, increased purchases of overseas property by Americans, and relocation and tax planning firms reporting unusually strong demand from U.S.-based clients, and a consistent pattern emerges. This is no longer just anecdotal, and here's where it becomes more than a numbers story. Moving to another country is vastly more complicated than moving from, say, Ohio to Florida. You have to navigate visas, possibly new tax regimes, different healthcare systems, and sometimes new languages and cultures. That's not something most people do on a whim. They do it when they feel the benefits clearly outweigh the costs and risks. I spent some time in Portugal recently, and what stood out wasn't just how many Americans were there. It was who they were. They weren't mostly students backpacking through Europe or people on a temporary break. They were parents whose children were enrolled in local schools, mid-career professionals working remotely for U.S. or international companies, small business owners building new ventures, retirees who had sold their homes in the U.S. and described their move as long-term, not experimental. When I asked what drove their decision, the answers tended to be calm and practical, not angry political speeches. A few themes came up again and again. I don't want to worry about everyday environments feeling unsafe. I don't want my kids constantly practicing emergency drills. I don't want to risk one major health event wiping out our savings. I just feel more relaxed here. That sense of lower stress was the common thread. In Portugal, serious violent incidents are relatively rare. Attacks on schools are extremely uncommon. Healthcare costs are generally more predictable, with fewer massive surprise bills for typical scenarios. Insurance expenses don't tend to jump around as dramatically year to year. Childcare, while not free, can be much more affordable than in many major American metros. The overall pace of life feels slower. When you bundle all of that, concerns about safety, medical costs, housing, and political tension, you're really talking about quality of life. Interestingly, none of the people I spoke with framed their decision as rejecting their country outright. Many still said they feel culturally American and maintain strong emotional ties. They described the move as a rational decision after comparing systems. They looked at healthcare structures. They compared crime statistics. They examined school environments and costs. They weighed work-life balance. Then they chose the option that, in their view, offered more stability. That's what makes this moment distinctive. It doesn't present like panic. It looks more like a strategic realignment by people who have flexibility. Here's the uncomfortable economic angle. The individuals able to make these moves are often the same ones who contribute heavily to local economies: skilled workers, dual-income families, entrepreneurs, investors. They tend to pay substantial taxes, buy properties, start companies, and raise children who become part of the future workforce. If that group slowly disperses across Europe and other regions, the effects are cumulative. You won't see a dramatic economic cliff overnight, but over years, you can see it in labor markets, school enrollments, new business creation, and the tax base. So we have two layers of evidence: measurable signs that more Americans are establishing lives elsewhere, and personal testimonies that many of them are doing it for reasons of safety, predictability, and lower stress. But that still leaves a crucial question. Is this mainly political? Or is it more about deep structural pressures that would persist regardless of who is in the White House? At first glance, it's tempting to say it's purely political, a reaction to one administration or one figure. Politics clearly plays a role, and we'll come to that. But if we stop there, we miss underlying trends that have been building for many years. Start with housing. In a lot of U.S. cities, home prices have risen much faster than incomes. For many younger households, owning a home near job centers feels out of reach. Rents have consumed a bigger slice of paychecks. Entry-level homes are increasingly scarce in some markets. Layer on top of that the healthcare system. Even people with coverage often navigate high premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket caps that can turn routine issues into real financial strain. The fear of a large unexpected bill is part of everyday life for many families. In some regions, childcare costs are comparable to, or higher than, college tuition. Student loan balances follow people into their 30s and 40s, shaping decisions about when to buy a home, when to have children, or whether to launch a business. And beneath all of that is a work culture that, in many industries, leans toward long hours, limited guaranteed parental leave, and fewer social safety nets than in many other advanced economies. Burnout is increasingly documented in surveys. Gallup has asked Americans whether they would move permanently to another country if they had the opportunity. Around 1 in 5 now say yes. During the 2008 financial crisis, one of the most severe economic shocks in decades, only about 1 in 10 said the same. That share has roughly doubled. The important phrase in that question is, if they had the opportunity. Many do not. Immigration systems are complex. Relocation is expensive. Certain careers are strongly tied to a specific location. Family obligations like caring for elderly parents keep a lot of people anchored. So if roughly 20% say they would go if they could, that suggests the latent desire to leave is much larger than the visible number who actually do it. At the same time, we have more than 100,000 American students studying abroad, which is a new high. Those students are building networks and familiarity outside the U.S. earlier in life. For them, the idea of a career and family life in another country doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels like one of several normal options. On the flip side, international student numbers in the U.S., a long-standing engine of innovation and future immigration, have softened from previous highs in certain years. That slows one of the country's traditional talent pipelines. When more people go out and, in some periods, relatively fewer come in, you start to see early signs of a structural change in the talent base. Structural pressures like housing, healthcare, childcare, and education debt rarely vanish in one election cycle. They tend to shift slowly. For some Americans, moving abroad is less about making a political statement and more about managing long-term risk. With that said, we still need to talk about politics because for a segment of the population, the political environment has clearly been a catalyst. Donald Trump's second term has been marked by expanded deportation efforts, stricter immigration enforcement, and heightened tensions around campuses and public debate. Supporters view these moves as strengthening borders, clarifying rules, and reasserting sovereignty. Critics see them as unsettling and potentially discouraging to the institutions and flows of people that have historically supported American innovation and soft power. Regardless of viewpoint, perceptions can be just as powerful as facts when it comes to personal decisions. And there is clearly a group of Americans who feel the country is more volatile now than it was a decade ago. That's where the Donald Dash nickname comes from. The notion that Trump's return nudged people who were already considering a move to finally take action. The reported increase in citizenship renunciations before his swearing in, the jump in activity on relocation forums, and the spike in interest in foreign property all reflect that. But it's worth being precise. Trump did not create high housing costs on his own. He did not single-handedly design the U.S. healthcare framework or cause all student debt and childcare expenses. Those issues have deep roots. What his political comeback may have signaled to some people is that the direction they were worried about, politically and institutionally, might not be temporary. Historically, people tend to leave their home countries when they lose confidence in stability, economic, political, or institutional. In the 20th and 21st centuries, citizens have departed from various countries during periods of severe economic crisis or rising authoritarianism, opting for environments they perceived as more predictable. In many of those stories, the United States was the place people moved to, not the place they left. That's what makes the current flow so notable. We're not talking about collapse or widespread humanitarian emergency. We're talking about a more gradual loss of confidence among people with options. Confidence is intangible, but it matters. When professionals conclude that their long-term safety, health security, and work-life balance might be better in another advanced economy, some of them act on that conclusion. The core question isn't whether the U.S. is falling apart. It's whether enough individuals are experiencing enough friction that moving abroad feels like a reasonable, even prudent, choice. And once relocation stops being seen as extreme and starts to feel normal within a social network, once your friend moves to Lisbon, your coworker to Berlin, your cousin to Dublin, the psychological hurdle gets lower. That's how demographic changes often begin. Gradually, through thousands of individual decisions. There's another angle that often gets less attention: population and economic growth. In recent years, some high-profile voices in business and politics have warned about declining birth rates in advanced economies, including the U.S. The argument is that if you have fewer workers in the future, you face challenges funding pensions and healthcare programs and sustaining innovation and growth. But population growth isn't just about babies, it's about people. Working-age adults building companies, paying taxes, and raising families. If you simultaneously tighten immigration and watch more of your own citizens set up lives abroad, you're constraining both sides. Fewer newcomers coming in, more residents going out. Even if only a small share of working-age Americans leave each year, engineers, healthcare workers, entrepreneurs, remote professionals, the effect compounds. You lose their current contributions and their future potential. The companies they might have founded, the teams they might have led, and the children they might have raised in the U.S. end up somewhere else. Those future children don't disappear. They grow up in different school systems, pay taxes in different jurisdictions, and innovate in different economies. From a demographic perspective, that's not just slower growth. It's a reallocation of human capital between countries. Many demographers and economists have argued that, given U.S. fertility trends and an aging population, keeping the workforce stable will likely require maintaining or even expanding legal immigration. Historically, immigration has been the U.S.'s way of cushioning demographic shocks. It has kept the labor force younger and supported industries from tech to medicine to academia. So when public debate is heavily focused on restricting entry, at the same time as more Americans are exploring exits, you create a long-term imbalance. You can't be deeply worried about an aging population and lower birth rates while also shrinking the pool of both incoming and remaining workers without facing arithmetic constraints down the line. Programs like Social Security and Medicare rely on a healthy ratio of workers to retirees. Broader economic growth depends on having enough skilled, motivated people building things inside your borders. If mobile, skilled Americans are leaving and fewer newcomers are able to replace them, the base of the demographic pyramid narrows. Initially, that shows up in certain job markets and regional growth patterns. Over time, it can show up in budget stress and slower innovation. To be clear, none of this implies that borders should be wide open or that immigration policy is simple. It's not. Security, integration, and labor market fit all matter. But demographic math tends to assert itself over the long run. We've already seen countries like Japan and some European nations grapple with the consequences of aging populations and limited immigration. The U.S. largely avoided the worst of that scenario in the past because of immigration and relatively higher fertility compared with some peers. If both soften, that safety margin shrinks, which brings us back again to confidence. When citizens believe that, over the long term, their quality of life, financial, social, and personal, will be better in another country, they move. When potential immigrants perceive that a country has fewer opportunities or more barriers, they go elsewhere. Today, global mobility is easier than ever. Remote work allows income to cross borders. Digital tools let businesses operate from almost anywhere. Many highly skilled professionals have multiple options. So the competition isn't just between political parties within one country. It's between national systems offering different combinations of safety, opportunity, and stability. That doesn't mean America loses by default. It means the United States is now in a more direct competition for talent, families, and entrepreneurs than perhaps at any point in its recent history. For a long time, the assumption was simple. People around the world want to come here. Increasingly, individuals are doing side-by-side comparisons instead of treating that as automatic. They look at healthcare costs and outcomes, housing affordability, education expenses, public safety, parental leave, visas, and tax rules. They run the numbers on their own lives. That raises an important question that isn't discussed enough. What changes would make Americans feel confident about staying or coming back if they've left? Would it be more predictable and affordable healthcare? Better access to housing near economic centers? Stronger support for families and childcare? immigration and education reforms that protect security but also attract and retain talent, a less polarized, more predictable political environment? If the trend of Americans considering or pursuing life abroad continues, simply ignoring it won't make it go away. If this discussion helps you see a bigger picture behind the occasional headlines, consider sharing it with someone who's been wondering whether this is hype or something more fundamental. These conversations are more effective before long-term trends become locked in. The nickname Donald Dash might get attention, but the forces at work here go beyond any single presidency. They're about stress, opportunity structures, demographic realities, and national self-confidence. The U.S. still has world-class universities, deep capital markets, enormous cultural influence, and a leading role in many technologies. But even strong advantages can erode if they're assumed to be permanent. The core issue isn't whether a certain number of people move abroad this year. It's whether the mindset is shifting, whether leaving the U.S. is starting to feel like a practical option rather than a rare exception. Once that mindset spreads, the flow of people can become self-reinforcing. Whenever this topic comes up, people often ask a personal question. Would you ever leave? And I understand why. When you spend time looking at families who have moved, professionals who are diversifying their options, students who are studying abroad and not necessarily returning, it naturally forces you to think about your own situation. If you have skills that are in demand, if your work can be done remotely, if you qualify for another passport or a residency visa, do you at least consider it? For a growing number of Americans, the answer is yes, at least as a thought experiment. Some have access to dual citizenship through parents or grandparents. Others qualify for digital nomad visas, investment-based residencies, or ancestry routes in various countries. A generation ago, many of these programs either didn't exist or weren't widely known. Today, they're advertised globally. Governments actively compete for high-earning professionals and business founders. Entire industries, from tax advisory firms to international property brokers to relocation consultants, exist to serve this demand. So the practical barriers are lower. But relocation is never just a financial or legal equation. It's also emotional and cultural. Leaving means changing where your family lives, where your memories are anchored, where your sense of identity feels most at home. For many people, moving permanently would mean trading familiarity and cultural comfort for more systemic stability or predictability. That's not a simple trade. Personally, I'm not in the middle of planning my own exit, but I do understand why others are weighing it, especially if they feel politically isolated in their region or squeezed by local housing and living costs. I understand parents who are worn down by school safety worries. I understand families who have gone through the healthcare numbers and decided they don't want that level of uncertainty. I understand young adults who look at home prices and feel that the traditional American dream is out of reach where they live. Understanding these motivations doesn't mean claiming the U.S. is beyond repair. It means recognizing that perception heavily shapes behavior. If enough people perceive instability, whether financial, political, or social, they will hedge. Some diversify their assets internationally. Some apply for second passports or foreign residencies. Some try a year abroad and simply don't come back. So where does this leave the United States? One of America's greatest long-term strengths has been its magnetism, the belief that this is the place where ambition is rewarded, where talent can rise, and where the future feels open-ended. If more and more Americans themselves start to question that story for their own lives, that's something policymakers and business leaders can't afford to ignore. The important questions are, is this a short-term spike tied to one political era, or the beginning of a longer demographic adjustment? Is this mostly surface-level frustration, or a deeper shift in confidence? Demographic changes rarely announce themselves with a single dramatic event. They emerge quietly, through thousands of personal decisions. Students who don't come back, professionals who move their companies, families who plant roots elsewhere. Over time, those decisions show up in statistics, and those statistics shape budgets, policies, and national trajectories. America is still powerful, innovative, and attractive to millions around the world. But for the first time in modern memory, a noticeable and growing number of its own citizens are seriously considering whether their next chapter might unfold somewhere else. That alone makes this moment worth paying attention to. Whether the so-called Donald Dash ends up as a footnote or the opening chapter of a larger transformation will depend on what happens next, on policy decisions, economic reforms, and whether leaders respond to the stress points that are pushing people to reconsider their future. When citizens with options begin exercising those options, the message is clear. They're asking for change. And history suggests that when such signals are ignored for too long, they don't disappear. They simply become harder and more expensive to address later.